It's 1942. Across Europe, from the snow-covered fields of Poland to the Mediterranean shores of Greece, millions of people wake up each day under the shadow of the swastika. But while history books focus on battles and political decisions, there's a darker story that often goes untold. What did the occupying forces actually do with their time? How did they pass the hours between official duties? The answer is more disturbing than you might imagine. Today, we're going to explore the daily reality of Nazi occupation through the lens of how German soldiers, SS officers, and administrators chose to spend their leisure time. What you're about to discover reveals the true nature of the occupation system, not just as a military operation, but as a prolonged period of systematic cruelty disguised as entertainment. When German forces swept across Europe between 1939 and 1942, they brought with them not just military might, but an entire ideology that classified human beings into categories of worth. This worldview didn't just influence policy, it shaped how individual soldiers and officers viewed their daily interactions with the local population. For many German personnel stationed in occupied territories, the war had created an unusual situation. They found themselves with significant free time, comfortable living conditions confiscated from local residents, and virtually unlimited authority over civilian populations. The combination proved toxic. Hans Müller, a Wehrmacht soldier stationed in occupied Ukraine, wrote to his family describing his daily routine. Between morning roll call and evening reports, he and his comrades had hours to fill. What they chose to do with that time reflected the dehumanizing training they had received and the racist ideology that had been drilled into them for years. The occupied territories became a playground where normal moral constraints were suspended. Officers requisitioned the finest homes, appropriated valuable possessions, and treated local residents as a source of entertainment. The psychological distance created by Nazi racial ideology made it easier to view acts of cruelty as legitimate recreation rather than criminal behavior. The living conditions of German occupation forces varied significantly by region and rank, but most enjoyed privileges that starkly contrasted with the suffering of local populations. High-ranking SS officers commandeered mansions and estates, complete with servants who were forced to maintain the properties and cater to their every need. Lower-ranking soldiers lived in requisitioned apartments and houses, often displacing entire families who were either killed or forced into overcrowded ghetto conditions. These comfortable living arrangements created an atmosphere of leisure that many German personnel had never experienced in their civilian lives. Young men from working-class backgrounds found themselves living in luxury, with access to fine furniture, artwork, and amenities that had been stripped from their rightful owners. This sudden elevation in lifestyle, combined with absolute authority over local populations, created a sense of entitlement that extended to all aspects of their daily existence. The daily routines of occupation forces were deliberately structured to include significant periods of unscheduled time. Unlike combat units that faced constant military pressures, garrison troops and administrative personnel often worked relatively short hours managing the bureaucracy of occupation. This left long periods of the day and evening free for personal activities and entertainment. In Poland, German administrators organized elaborate hunting parties, but these weren't always focused on animals. They would round up local intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders, forcing them to perform humiliating tasks for the amusement of the occupying forces. The psychological torture was methodical and deliberate, designed to break the spirit of potential resistance leaders while providing entertainment for the German participants. The selection process for these activities was often as cruel as the events themselves. German officers would maintain lists of prominent local citizens, discussing their backgrounds, education levels, and social standing as if they were choosing performers for a theatrical production. University professors, doctors, lawyers, and religious leaders were particular favorites because their obvious distress at being forced into degrading situations provided maximum entertainment value. The gradual escalation of these activities followed a predictable pattern. What began as minor humiliations, forcing a priest to sweep streets or making a doctor carry heavy loads, gradually evolved into more elaborate and psychologically damaging scenarios. German personnel would compete with each other to devise new forms of entertainment, with peer pressure and social dynamics driving increasingly creative cruelty. The documentation of these early activities reveals the casual attitude that German forces developed toward human suffering. Personal letters home often described humiliating local civilians in the same tone used to discuss card games or social gatherings. This normalization of cruelty was a crucial psychological step that enabled the escalation that would follow. The role of alcohol in these activities cannot be overlooked. German occupation forces had access to confiscated liquor stores and wine cellars throughout occupied Europe. Evening drinking sessions often evolved into impromptu entertainment sessions, where intoxicated soldiers would send for local civilians to provide amusement. The combination of alcohol, power, and racist ideology created a particularly toxic environment for creativity and cruelty. But this was just the beginning. The real horror lay in how systematically the occupation forces turned human suffering into spectacle. The German occupation authorities developed an elaborate system of public humiliation that served multiple purposes. It demonstrated their power, terrorized the local population, and provided entertainment for the occupying forces. These weren't spontaneous acts of individual cruelty. They were organized events that entire units would attend. In Warsaw, German soldiers regularly forced elderly Jewish men to perform calisthenics in the streets, while crowds of soldiers watched and laughed. The victims were made to do push-ups, jumping jacks, and other exercises until they collapsed from exhaustion. The soldiers would place bets on how long each person could continue before falling. The betting aspect became a crucial component of these spectacles. German soldiers would create elaborate wagering systems around the suffering of civilians, treating human endurance and dignity as commodities for gambling. Stakes could range from cigarettes and alcohol to more valuable items confiscated from local populations. The competitive element added a game-like quality that made participation more appealing to German personnel. The pattern repeated across occupied Europe with local variations. In France, German officers would force French citizens to crawl through mud while barking like dogs. In Norway, they made local fishermen perform mock parades wearing their traditional costumes while German soldiers jeered and threw objects at them. Each region developed its own specific forms of entertainment based on local cultural symbols and traditions. These spectacles often took place in town squares, ensuring maximum visibility to the local population. The message was clear: resistance was futile, and the occupiers held absolute power over every aspect of civilian life. But for the German participants, these events were social occasions, opportunities to bond with fellow soldiers while asserting their supposed superiority. The timing of these public humiliations was carefully planned to maximize their psychological impact. German forces would often schedule them during traditional market days, religious observances, or community gatherings when the largest number of local residents would be forced to witness the degradation of their neighbors. This strategic timing served both to terrorize the maximum number of people and to provide the largest possible audience for German entertainment. Photography became a crucial element of these activities. German soldiers would pose with their victims, creating souvenirs of their actions. These photographs were often sent home to families or kept as mementos. The casual nature of these images, soldiers smiling while civilians suffered, reveals the extent to which cruelty had become normalized. The photographic documentation served multiple purposes beyond personal memento making. German military censors would often approve these images for publication in newspapers and magazines back in Germany, presenting them as evidence of German superiority and control over inferior populations. The photographs became propaganda tools that reinforced the ideological justifications for the occupation, while providing visual entertainment for German civilians. Professional photographers were sometimes employed to document these events more systematically. The German military maintained extensive photographic archives of occupation activities, including detailed documentation of public humiliation spectacles. These professional photographs were often more composed and artistic than personal snapshots, treating human suffering as legitimate subject matter for artistic expression. In the Baltic states, German forces organized elaborate competitions where local residents were forced to compete in degrading contests. The winners might receive slightly better treatment or extra food rations, while the losers faced additional punishment. The soldiers would cheer and place bets, treating human dignity as a form of gambling entertainment. These competitions often had elaborate rules and scoring systems that German forces would spend considerable time developing and refining, Different types of contests would be created for different categories of victims, separate events for men, women, elderly, and children. The complexity of these rule systems reveals the substantial time and energy that German forces devoted to systematizing their entertainment activities. The prizes offered in these competitions were carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact. Winners might receive a few extra calories of food, slightly better sleeping accommodations, or temporary relief from other forms of harassment. The meager nature of these rewards highlighted the desperate circumstances of occupied populations while providing Germans with opportunities to play the role of beneficent rulers, dispensing favors to grateful subjects. The scoring systems used in these competitions often incorporated elements designed to humiliate participants beyond the basic requirements of the contest itself. Judges might award points for expressions of gratitude, demonstrations of subservience, or willingness to denounce other community members. These additional criteria turned simple physical contests into complex psychological torture sessions. The psychological impact on victims was devastating, but the effect on the perpetrators was equally significant. Each act of cruelty made the next one easier to justify. What began as following orders gradually transformed into seeking out opportunities for sadistic entertainment. German personnel would often compete among themselves to devise new forms of public humiliation, with social status within military units partially determined by creativity in developing entertainment activities. The normalization process was accelerated by the group nature of these activities. Individual German soldiers who might have felt uncomfortable with cruelty when alone found it much easier to participate when surrounded by cheering comrades. The social pressure to conform combined with the competitive elements to create an environment where refusing to participate in public humiliation spectacles would itself become a source of social isolation within German units. And these public displays were just the visible portion of a much larger system of abuse that extended into every corner of occupied life. While public humiliation served as mass entertainment, German occupation forces also developed more intimate forms of recreational cruelty. Private homes, confiscated from local residents, became venues for elaborate parties where human suffering was the primary entertainment. SS officers in occupied Czechoslovakia would host dinner parties where local civilians were forced to serve as entertainment. Families would be brought in and made to perform various tasks, cleaning floors with their own clothing, eating scraps from the floor, or engaging in mock trials where they were forced to confess to imaginary crimes. The German guests would dine while watching these performances, treating human degradation as dinner theater. The most disturbing aspect of these private gatherings was their casual nature. German officers would invite colleagues over for an evening of cards or conversation, and the entertainment of tormenting local civilians was simply part of the hospitality. These weren't special events. They were routine social gatherings where cruelty had become as normal as serving wine. The social calendar of German occupation forces became increasingly elaborate as they competed to host the most memorable gatherings. Invitations would be extended weeks in advance, with hosts promising particularly creative or unusual entertainment for their guests. The planning process itself became a form of entertainment, as officers would discuss various options for amusing their colleagues, while deciding which local residents would provide the best performance value. The venues for these private gatherings were carefully chosen to maximize both comfort for German participants and psychological impact on victims. Confiscated homes of wealthy local residents provided appropriate settings, with former owners' personal possessions serving as props for various entertainment scenarios. Family photographs, religious objects, and cultural artifacts would be incorporated into humiliation activities, adding layers of psychological torture to the basic degradation. In occupied Poland, German administrators developed a practice they called evening entertainment. They would select local residents, often choosing teachers, doctors, or other educated professionals, and bring them to private gatherings where they were forced to perform degrading acts while the Germans socialized. The victims might be made to recite Nazi propaganda, perform mock ceremonies, or engage in activities designed to destroy their dignity. The selection process itself became a form of entertainment. German officers would spend time choosing their guests for these events, discussing the merits of different victims, and planning elaborate scenarios. The anticipation and planning were as much a part of the entertainment as the events themselves. These selection meetings would often take place over meals or drinks, with German officers reviewing files and photographs of potential victims, like casting directors choosing actors for a production. Discussions would focus on which individuals would provide the most interesting reactions to various forms of degradation, with particular attention paid to those whose social status or professional accomplishments would make their humiliation more dramatically satisfying. The elaborate planning process could extend over several days or weeks for particularly important social gatherings. German officers would create detailed scripts and scenarios, sometimes even conducting rehearsals with previous victims to ensure that upcoming events would proceed smoothly. This level of preparation reveals the substantial time and energy that occupation forces devoted to perfecting their entertainment activities. These private gatherings often included elaborate rituals designed to maximize psychological impact. Victims might be forced to dress in specific ways, follow complex rules, or participate in mock ceremonies that parodied their religious or cultural traditions. The Germans would create detailed scripts for these performances, treating real human beings as actors in their sadistic productions. The ritual aspects of these gatherings often incorporated elements from victims' own cultural and religious traditions, twisted into forms designed to cause maximum psychological damage. Christian ministers might be forced to perform blasphemous parodies of religious ceremonies, while Jewish victims would be made to participate in mock rituals that desecrated their sacred traditions. The familiarity of the ritual elements made the degradation more personally devastating for victims. Costume requirements for these private entertainments became increasingly elaborate over time. German hosts would sometimes invest considerable resources in creating specific outfits designed to humiliate victims in particular ways. Traditional cultural dress might be modified to include degrading elements, or victims might be forced to wear combinations of clothing that violated their cultural or religious norms. The intimate nature of these gatherings made them particularly traumatic for victims. Unlike public humiliation, which at least had witnesses, these private entertainments left victims isolated with their tormentors. The psychological damage was often more severe than physical abuse, as victims were forced to participate in their own degradation while maintaining the pretense of normalcy. The privacy of these gatherings also enabled German forces to engage in forms of cruelty that would have been impractical or inappropriate for public display. More complex psychological torture scenarios could be developed and implemented when the only witnesses were other German personnel. This privacy allowed for the creation of more personalized forms of degradation, tailored to the specific vulnerabilities of individual victims. The social dynamics within these private gatherings created additional layers of psychological complexity for both perpetrators and victims. German guests would compete to demonstrate their creativity in devising new forms of entertainment, while victims were forced to navigate the competing demands and expectations of multiple tormentors simultaneously. The resulting psychological environment was often more chaotic and unpredictable than more structured public events. Documentation of these private gatherings was often more detailed and personal than records of public events. German participants would keep personal diaries describing particularly memorable entertainments, and hosts would sometimes create guest books where attendees could record their impressions of the evening's activities. These personal records provide unique insights into the psychological processes that enabled such systematic cruelty. But the occupation forces weren't content with individual victims. They began to systematically target entire communities for their entertainment. The German occupation forces discovered that destroying social bonds and community structures provided a particularly satisfying form of entertainment. They developed elaborate schemes to turn neighbors against each other, creating drama and conflict that could be observed and enjoyed like a theatrical performance. In occupied Yugoslavia, German administrators would deliberately spread false information about local residents, claiming that certain individuals were collaborators or resistance members. They would then sit back and watch as communities tore themselves apart with suspicion and accusations. The Germans treated these manufactured conflicts as ongoing entertainment, placing bets on which families would turn against each other first. The information warfare tactics used to create these community conflicts were sophisticated and psychologically calculated. German intelligence officers would study local social dynamics, identifying existing tensions, rivalries, and grievances that could be exploited and amplified. They would then craft false intelligence reports designed to exacerbate these natural friction points, turning minor disagreements into major community divisions. The Germans would often establish multiple competing sources of false information, ensuring that different segments of the community received contradictory stories about the same individuals. This created an environment of complete uncertainty where no one could be trusted, and every neighbor became a potential threat. The resulting paranoia and social breakdown provided ongoing entertainment for German observers who would monitor the deteriorating situation like spectators watching a slow-motion disaster. The betting systems that German forces established around these manufactured conflicts became increasingly complex over time. Officers would create pools predicting which community leaders would be accused of collaboration, which families would publicly denounce each other, and how long it would take for specific friendships to dissolve under pressure. The wagering added a competitive element that made the destruction of human relationships more engaging for German participants. The forced relocation of populations became another source of amusement. German officers would organize the displacement of entire villages, but they would structure these operations as competitions or games. Families might be told they could keep certain possessions if they could complete arbitrary tasks within time limits. The officers would watch as desperate people struggled to meet impossible demands, finding humor in their desperation. These relocation competitions were designed with deliberately impossible or contradictory requirements that ensured most participants would fail. A family might be told they could keep their household goods if they could transport them to a new location within an unrealistic time frame, or they might be given multiple conflicting sets of instructions about what items were permitted and what routes they should take. German officers would watch these desperate attempts to comply with impossible demands while socializing and placing bets on the outcomes. The psychological cruelty of these relocation games extended beyond the immediate logistical challenges. Families would be forced to make devastating choices about which possessions to abandon, which family members to prioritize, and which community connections to maintain. German officers would often intervene at crucial moments to change the rules or create new obstacles, maximizing the emotional distress of participants while providing additional entertainment value. Religious communities faced particularly creative forms of persecution designed for German entertainment. In occupied Lithuania, German forces would force priests and rabbis to perform mock religious ceremonies that blasphemed their own faiths. The occupiers would attend these forced performances, laughing at the obvious distress of the religious leaders, while treating the destruction of sacred traditions as comedy. The desecration of religious practices was often combined with forced education programs, where religious leaders were required to teach their congregations Nazi ideology, using religious language and symbols. Priests would be forced to deliver sermons praising Hitler as a divine figure, while rabbis were made to incorporate anti-Semitic propaganda into their religious instruction. The psychological torture of forcing religious leaders to destroy their own spiritual authority provided entertainment that could last for weeks or months. The Germans also developed elaborate schemes to corrupt local officials and community leaders. They would offer small privileges or protections in exchange for increasingly degrading acts of collaboration. The process of watching respected community members compromise their principles provided ongoing entertainment for the occupation forces. These corruption schemes were structured as gradual escalation processes that began with seemingly minor compromises and gradually evolved into more serious betrayals of community trust. A local official might first be asked to provide lists of residents, then to participate in selecting individuals for forced labor, and finally to publicly denounce former colleagues or friends. German officers would monitor these progression carefully, taking entertainment from watching the psychological deterioration of individuals caught in these moral traps. The public nature of many corruption activities was carefully designed to maximize both the entertainment value for Germans and the psychological impact on communities. Officials who had been forced into collaboration would be required to perform their betrayals in public settings, where their former constituents could witness their degradation. The visible destruction of moral authority figures provided entertainment while simultaneously eliminating potential sources of resistance leadership. Educational institutions became particular targets for recreational destruction. German officers would visit schools and force teachers to present lessons that contradicted everything they believed in. Students would be made to participate in activities designed to humiliate their instructors. The Germans would attend these sessions as spectators, enjoying the psychological torture of watching educators forced to destroy their own life's work. The transformation of educational settings into entertainment venues involved forcing teachers to present curricula that not only contradicted their professional knowledge but actively promoted ideologies they found morally reprehensible. Science teachers were forced to present racial theories as biological fact. History teachers had to teach revisionist accounts of German superiority, and literature teachers were required to analyze works that promoted Nazi ideology while denigrating their own cultural traditions. The systematic nature of these community destruction efforts reveals their true purpose. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence. They were carefully planned entertainment programs designed to provide ongoing amusement for German personnel while simultaneously achieving political and psychological objectives. Marriage ceremonies and family celebrations became targets for particularly cruel interventions. German soldiers would interrupt weddings, funerals, and other important family events, forcing the participants to include elements that mocked their own traditions. The emotional devastation caused by these interruptions provided entertainment for the occupiers, while creating lasting trauma for the victims. The timing of these interventions was carefully planned to maximize emotional impact. German forces would often allow celebrations to proceed normally until the most emotionally significant moments, such as wedding vows, funeral eulogies, or birthday wishes, before intervening to force the inclusion of degrading elements. This timing ensured that the most precious family memories would be permanently contaminated with associations of humiliation and powerlessness. But perhaps the most systematic and organized form of recreational cruelty involved the exploitation of labor itself. The German occupation forces transformed forced labor from a mere economic necessity into elaborate entertainment spectacles. Work assignments became opportunities for creative cruelty, with German supervisors competing to devise the most psychologically damaging tasks. In occupied Belgium, German officers would assign civilians to perform completely pointless tasks while under constant observation. Workers might be forced to dig holes and then immediately fill them back in, carry heavy objects back and forth between identical locations, or sort piles of materials that would be deliberately mixed up again. The Germans would watch these activities while socializing, treating the meaningless labor as a form of live performance art. The assignment of work itself became a form of entertainment. German administrators would hold elaborate ceremonies where work assignments were distributed like prizes at a carnival. Civilians would be forced to compete for the privilege of certain types of labor, while the Germans watched and laughed at the desperation of people fighting for slightly less degrading work options. Skilled professionals were particular targets for entertaining labor assignments. German officers took special pleasure in forcing doctors to work as janitors, teachers to perform manual labor, and engineers to dig ditches. The psychological impact of these inappropriate assignments was carefully calculated, and the Germans would often invite colleagues to observe the distress of educated professionals forced into menial labor. The Germans developed elaborate point systems and competitions around forced labor. Civilian workers would be ranked and scored based on arbitrary criteria, with the Germans treating human beings like game pieces in an elaborate contest. Winners might receive marginally better treatment, while losers faced additional punishment, creating a system where survival depended on providing entertainment value. Worksites became venues for sadistic games. German supervisors would create artificial emergencies, set impossible deadlines, or change requirements at the last minute, then watch as workers scrambled to meet new demands. The panic and desperation of workers trying to avoid punishment provided ongoing amusement for their German overseers. The Germans also developed a practice of forcing skilled workers to train their replacements, often German civilians or prisoners of war, while knowing that this training would eventually result in their own execution or deportation. The psychological torture of being forced to participate in their own replacement provided entertainment for German supervisors who would mock the workers' obvious distress. Construction projects became elaborate theatrical productions. German officers would design buildings or infrastructure projects specifically to maximize the suffering of workers, rather than to create functional structures. The process of watching workers struggle with impossible architectural demands provided ongoing entertainment, while the Germans socialized at the work sites. The documentation of these labor entertainments became part of the activity itself. German supervisors would photograph workers in various states of exhaustion or distress, creating albums of human suffering that could be shared with colleagues or sent home as souvenirs. The casual nature of this documentation reveals how thoroughly normalized the cruelty had become. But the occupation forces weren't satisfied with individual or community-level entertainment. They began to organize large-scale events that involved entire populations. The German occupation authorities discovered that organizing large-scale public events provided opportunities for both political control and mass entertainment. These weren't traditional rallies or demonstrations. They were elaborate spectacles designed to humiliate entire populations while providing amusement for German personnel and their collaborators. In occupied Czechoslovakia, German administrators organized what they called appreciation ceremonies, where entire towns were forced to participate in elaborate shows of gratitude to their occupiers. Citizens would be required to dress in their finest clothes, prepare traditional foods, and perform cultural dances, while German officers watched and mocked their performances. The contrast between the forced celebration and the obvious distress of the participants provided entertainment for the occupying forces. The scale of these appreciation ceremonies required months of planning and preparation, with German administrators coordinating every aspect of the events to maximize both their propaganda value and their entertainment potential. Local officials were forced to organize committees responsible for different aspects of the celebrations, creating a bureaucracy of collaboration that implicated entire communities in their own humiliation. The preparation process itself became a form of ongoing entertainment for German forces. They would attend planning meetings as observers, watching local officials struggle to meet impossible demands while maintaining the fiction that the celebrations were voluntary expressions of genuine gratitude. The obvious distress of community leaders forced to organize these events provided amusement that extended over weeks or months of preparation. These mass events often included elaborate costume requirements. German officers would demand that participants wear specific clothing that was designed to be humiliating or inappropriate. Traditional cultural dress might be modified to include Nazi symbols, or participants might be forced to wear signs or markers that identified them in degrading ways. The visual impact of these costume requirements was carefully planned to maximize both the humiliation of participants and the amusement of German observers. The costume design process became an art form among German officers, who would compete to create the most psychologically damaging outfit requirements. Traditional clothing might be modified to incorporate elements that violated cultural or religious taboos, or participants might be required to wear combinations of garments that created ridiculous or undignified appearances. The time and creative energy invested in these costume requirements reveals the importance that entertainment value held within the occupation system. Seasonal celebrations provided particular opportunities for creative costume requirements. Christmas celebrations might require Christian participants to wear Stars of David, while Jewish communities might be forced to incorporate Christian symbols into their traditional dress. These religious cross-contaminations were designed to cause maximum psychological distress while providing visual entertainment for German observers. The Germans developed complex choreography for these mass spectacles. Entire populations would be required to learn and perform specific movements, songs, or chants that praised their occupiers while denigrating their own cultural traditions. The process of teaching these performances to unwilling participants provided ongoing entertainment, as German officers would mock the obvious reluctance and distress of people forced to participate in their own cultural destruction. The choreographic elements of these mass spectacles often incorporated movements and gestures that were deliberately designed to be physically uncomfortable or culturally inappropriate. Elderly participants might be required to perform energetic dances, while religious leaders might be forced to make gestures that violated their spiritual beliefs. The physical discomfort and cultural violation provided entertainment value while serving symbolic purposes. The musical elements of these performances were particularly sophisticated forms of cultural destruction. Traditional songs would be rewritten with lyrics praising Nazi ideology, while classical compositions would be rearranged to incorporate German military themes. Musicians were forced to perform these bastardized versions of their own cultural heritage, while German audiences laughed at the obvious distress of the performers. Seasonal celebrations became targets for particular attention. German officers would commandeer traditional holidays and festivals, forcing local populations to incorporate Nazi themes and German cultural elements into their own celebrations. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals, and other important cultural events became hybrid spectacles that combined traditional elements with Nazi propaganda and German entertainment preferences. The transformation of religious holidays was particularly sophisticated in its psychological cruelty. Christmas celebrations would be restructured to include praise for Hitler as a messianic figure, while Easter ceremonies would incorporate themes of German resurrection and renewal. The forced contamination of sacred celebrations created lasting trauma that extended far beyond the immediate experience of the events themselves. Cultural festivals were transformed into opportunities for competitive humiliation between different community groups. German officers would organize competitions between neighborhoods, ethnic groups, or professional organizations, forcing them to compete in displays of enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. The winners would receive minimal benefits, while the losers faced additional punishment, creating divisions within communities that served German political objectives while providing entertainment. The logistics of organizing these mass events became entertainment in themselves. German administrators would hold planning meetings where they discussed various options for maximizing the humiliation and distress of participants. These planning sessions were treated as social gatherings, with officers competing to propose the most creative and psychologically damaging elements for inclusion in upcoming events. The complexity of these planning sessions rivaled the organization of legitimate cultural festivals, with German officers creating detailed schedules, supply lists, and coordination protocols. The bureaucratic energy devoted to organizing mass humiliation reveals the systematic nature of these activities and their importance within the overall occupation strategy. Food played a crucial role in these mass spectacles. German officers would require participants to prepare elaborate feasts using ingredients that were scarce or expensive, knowing that families would have to sacrifice their own nutrition to meet the demands. The Germans would then consume these foods while the people who prepared them were forced to watch, creating a visual representation of the power imbalance that defined the occupation. The food requirements for these events were often deliberately impossible to fulfill using available resources, forcing communities to make devastating choices about how to allocate their limited supplies. Families would be required to contribute ingredients that represented weeks or months of savings, while the resulting meals would be consumed by German officers in a single evening of entertainment. The preparation of these elaborate feasts became additional opportunities for entertainment, as German officers would supervise the cooking process and mock the obvious distress of families forced to sacrifice their own nutrition for German pleasure. The psychological torture of watching one's own food being consumed by occupiers while one's children went hungry provided entertainment that extended far beyond the duration of the actual events. The Germans also developed elaborate systems for evaluating the quality of these mass performances. They would create judging criteria and scoring systems, treating entire populations like contestants in a competition. Communities that failed to meet German standards of enthusiasm or authenticity would face collective punishment, while those that provided particularly entertaining performances might receive minor benefits. These evaluation systems created additional psychological pressure on participants, who were forced to compete not only against their own moral principles, but also against other communities facing similar demands. The competitive element transformed mass spectacles into ongoing entertainment that could be sustained over multiple events and extended periods of time. The photographic documentation of these mass spectacles became a crucial element of their entertainment value. German officers would hire professional photographers to capture these events, creating elaborate albums that could be shared with superiors or sent back to Germany as evidence of their successful occupation policies. The images were often staged to maximize the visual contrast between German power and local submission. The creation of these photographic records became part of the entertainment itself, with German officers directing the positioning and expressions of participants to create more dramatically satisfying images. The forced participation in creating propaganda materials that celebrated their own oppression provided an additional layer of psychological torture for participants, while creating lasting souvenirs for German entertainment. But even these large-scale spectacles weren't sufficient to satisfy the appetites of the occupation forces. They began to develop more personalized and intimate forms of entertainment that targeted specific individuals and families. Understanding how ordinary German soldiers and officers became capable of treating human suffering as entertainment requires examining the psychological mechanisms that made such behavior possible. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of desensitization that began long before the war and accelerated under the conditions of occupation. The German military and SS training programs had systematically prepared personnel for their roles as occupiers. Recruits were taught to view certain populations as subhuman, making it psychologically easier to treat them as objects rather than people. This ideological foundation provided the justification for behavior that would have been unthinkable in other contexts. The social dynamics of military units played a crucial role in normalizing cruelty. New arrivals to occupation forces were often shocked by the behavior they witnessed, but peer pressure and the desire to fit in with their units gradually eroded their initial resistance. Participation in acts of cruelty became a form of social bonding, creating group loyalty built on shared participation in atrocities. The letters and diaries of German personnel reveal the psychological mechanisms they used to justify their behavior. Many wrote about their actions as if they were describing recreational activities, using language that emphasized the entertainment value rather than the human cost. This linguistic distancing helped maintain the psychological separation between their actions and their moral consequences. The hierarchy of the occupation system created a competitive environment where officers and soldiers competed to demonstrate their loyalty and effectiveness. Those who showed the most creativity in developing new forms of recreational cruelty were often rewarded with promotions or recognition. This created incentives for escalating brutality as personnel sought to advance their careers. The isolation of occupation forces from their home communities also contributed to the normalization of extreme behavior. Cut off from the moral frameworks of their civilian lives, German personnel developed new social norms within their military units. Behavior that would have been condemned in peacetime Germany became acceptable and even praiseworthy within the context of occupation duty. The bureaucratic nature of much of the cruelty also provided psychological cover for perpetrators. When entertainment activities were organized through official channels and documented in military reports, they acquired a veneer of legitimacy that made it easier for individuals to participate without acknowledging the true nature of their actions. The Germans also developed elaborate rationalization systems that portrayed their recreational cruelty as serving larger purposes. They would claim that humiliating civilians was necessary for maintaining order, that forced labor games improved productivity, or that mass spectacles served important political functions. These rationalizations allowed perpetrators to maintain a sense of moral purpose while engaging in clearly immoral behavior. The gradual escalation of cruelty also made it easier for individuals to cross moral boundaries. Someone who began by laughing at the humiliation of civilians might eventually participate in organizing such events, and from there, progress to more active forms of cruelty. Each step in the escalation process made the next step seem less significant by comparison, but the psychological mechanisms that enabled this behavior also created vulnerabilities that some individuals exploited for resistance. As the war turned against Germany and the occupation forces began to face the possibility of defeat, their recreational cruelty intensified rather than diminished. The knowledge that their time was limited led to a desperate acceleration of atrocities disguised as entertainment. In the final months of occupation, German forces began organizing what they called farewell ceremonies, elaborate events designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on civilian populations before the occupiers were forced to retreat. These events combined elements from all the previous forms of recreational cruelty, creating comprehensive spectacles of human degradation. The Germans also began to systematically destroy evidence of their recreational activities, while simultaneously creating new forms of entertainment around the destruction process itself. They would force civilian populations to participate in burning documents, destroying photographs, and dismantling facilities that had been used for previous entertainment events. The irony of forcing victims to help cover up their own victimization provided a final source of amusement for the departing occupiers. The retreat process itself became a form of entertainment. German forces would organize elaborate ceremonies where civilian populations were forced to thank their departing occupiers and express gratitude for the occupation experience. These forced gratitude ceremonies were designed to maximize psychological impact while providing final entertainment for German personnel. Some German units began to engage in what they called legacy projects, elaborate final acts of cruelty designed to create lasting trauma that would persist even after the occupation ended. These projects were often more psychologically sophisticated than previous entertainments, designed to create permanent psychological damage that would serve as a lasting reminder of German power. The documentation of these final phase activities became particularly important to the perpetrators. German officers would create elaborate records of their final entertainment events, treating them as the culmination of their occupation service. These documents were often more detailed and explicit than earlier records, as if the perpetrators wanted to ensure that their achievements would be remembered. The final phase also saw the emergence of revenge entertainments directed at local populations who had shown signs of resistance or non-cooperation. German forces would organize elaborate punishment ceremonies that were designed to serve both as entertainment and as warnings to others. These events often involved forcing entire communities to participate in the punishment of individuals who had been identified as troublemakers. The psychology of these final phase entertainments reveals the true nature of the occupation experience. Even when facing defeat and retreat, German forces remained committed to extracting maximum entertainment value from their interactions with civilian populations. The systematic nature of these final acts demonstrates that recreational cruelty had become so normalized that it continued even when it served no practical military or political purpose. The end of the occupation didn't immediately end the entertainment activities. German forces would sometimes return to areas they had previously occupied, specifically to engage in final acts of recreational cruelty, before permanently withdrawing. These return visits served no military purpose. They were purely for the entertainment of German personnel who wanted to revisit the scenes of their previous activities. The legacy of these entertainment activities extended far beyond the immediate occupation period. The psychological trauma inflicted on civilian populations had lasting effects that persisted for generations. The systematic nature of the recreational cruelty had created forms of collective trauma that continued to affect communities long after the occupiers had departed. The recreational cruelty of Nazi occupation forces reveals one of the most disturbing aspects of the Holocaust, not just violence, but the systematic enjoyment of dehumanization. These activities weren't anomalies. They were built into the occupation system, using psychological dominance to control and humiliate. From public spectacles to private entertainment, each act served political and sadistic purposes. The diaries and letters left behind show how deeply normalized this cruelty became, how ordinary people were drawn into extraordinary evil. Understanding this history helps us recognize similar patterns today, how dehumanization, social pressure, and moral erosion can lead to atrocities. Victims of these so-called entertainments deserve to be remembered as individuals, not statistics. The trauma inflicted often lasted longer than physical wounds. And yet, amid the darkness, some found ways to resist, to hold on to their humanity. Their stories remind us that even in the worst systems, moral choice remains possible. These lessons matter now more than ever. Recognizing how cruelty was normalized helps us guard against it in the present. If you found this video meaningful, please like and subscribe for more history documentaries. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.